My story is probably not unlike many others at the time. It starts with Final Fantasy VII. You can't talk about Final Fantasy Tactics without first talking about Final Fantasy VII. The two are inextricably linked through their close release dates and the fact that Tactics rode the success train of 7 to become the most beloved TRPG. In recently revealed marketing documents, credit Final Fantasy, An Oral History by Matt Leone, we see Square carefully coordinating the release date of Final Fantasy Tactics on the assumption that the install base from Final Fantasy VII will ensure a fertile market of 1 million US players. Final Fantasy VII is the game that captivated the then unconquered RPG market of the West with its groundbreaking 3D graphics, cutting-edge CG cutscenes, and striking cyberpunk aesthetics. Final Fantasy VII was advertised on Sony's dime, or should I say, millions of dimes, to resounding success. But to me, 5 years old, all I remember was watching my brother open our collective Christmas present and seeing a PlayStation in Final Fantasy VII, and wishing it was an N64. Oh, the naivety of youth! Once he popped in the disc and the opening cutscene started, I knew my brother had convinced our parents to make the right decision. We were a Sony family now. And while my child brain couldn't grasp the intricacies of the battle system, I did play through the majority of Final Fantasy VII through sheer trial and error at that tender age, and the seed of love for RPGs was planted firmly. Months later, a trip to Blockbuster would serve as water and sunlight to sprout that seed into the tactical tree you see here today. When we saw a PS1 game with the name Final Fantasy on it that wasn't 7, my brother and I knew we had to have it, or rent it. Starting up the game, it seemed that it bared no resemblance to 7 except for the chocobos. Gone was the sci-fi setting of Midgar, and the spiky-haired anime protagonist of 7, and here was a brooding fantasy world with a cow-licked main character. The battle system had some familiar aspects, but overall it seemed completely alien. Moving your units? Changing jobs? Percentages? What was this game? Was this really Final Fantasy? Those who had played the entries previous to 7 probably felt less whiplash, and if Tactics and Ivalice had been constructed by less capable hands, perhaps 7 would have been the final Final Fantasy for me. But as you may already know, Final Fantasy Tactics is fucking amazing. Still, being a child, the game crushed me, and even my older brother, over its knee at the slums of Dorter. I don't know how many times we rented the game from Blockbuster. Definitely enough times that my parents would have saved money by just buying us our own copy. I even stole the manual from the Blockbuster store, so on the weekends we didn't have it, I could read through it and gaze at the Hiroshi Minagawa and Akihiko Yoshida art. I didn't know their names back then. A few years later, on my 8th birthday, I had a pool party. I really had birthday parties because my birthday is during the summer, but this year was different, and the pool wasn't the highlight.
What have you got there, Shinji?
Basic physics primer.
Oh, you're such an obedient student.
Well, I'll have to study it anyway.
During the party, a schoolmate of mine, Jimmy Zen, handed me a loose disc with a smiley face sticker on it. That disc was Final Fantasy Tactics. The unlikeliness of this event still sticks in my mind as an adult. How did Jimmy Zen know? How was this loose disc free completely of scratches? Why did it have a smiley face sticker on it, if not to denote the joy it inspired? And yet Jimmy Zen was willing to bequeath that joy onto me. Shouts out to Jimmy Zen, and a belated apology. I have a vivid memory of getting worked up during dodgeball and pegging you with the ball extremely hard in the stomach with the textured rubber, no sting material. It still looked like it stinged quite a bit. Safe to say that birthday has yet to be topped, and unless they announce Final Fantasy Tactics 2 on my birthday, I would gather to say it never will be. Hey, but for now, let's talk about 15th century British politics. I've seen many articles comparing Final Fantasy Tactics story/setting to the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses being something I knew absolutely nothing about until this year when I dived into many documentaries, Alison Weir's book, The Wars of the Roses, and watching the dramatized/not very accurate Star series, The White Queen. Now I feel like an expert. In the 1400s, Britain had this king, Henry VI, and while he was really good at praying, he wasn't that good at being a monarch. He had been the king since he was a little less than a year old, because the previous king, his dad, Obvi, died at the tender age of 35. Until Henry VI's minority was over, minority being the period when a king too young to rule is not legally responsible for decision-making. The country was controlled by a group of nobles that were struggling for power, but still ruled the country okay. Unlike Henry VI's dad, Henry V, Henry VI was not a brave warrior, or particularly clever. Reports from the day refer to him as simple, but not in the way we would say simple to mean stupid, but more disinterested in the responsibilities of governing the kingdom. And even after his minority, this ineffectual king was used by the ruling nobles who would curry favor from him for more titles and lands, while the king was more focused on his pious pursuits. We can't blame it all on him though. Henry VI inherited an expensive war with France from his father, as well as a kingdom in debt with lawlessness on the rise. The war with France, now referred to as the 100 Years' War, which for those reading ahead might recognize as the inspiration almost assuredly of the 50 Years' War in Final Fantasy Tactics. Both of these wars have the main country fighting an outside country to the detriment of their kingdom financially, which leaves many soldiers and knights without pay, and thus they turn to brigandry. Unlike most wars. Also important to note, Henry VI is married to Queen Margaret of Anjou, a French noblewoman, who ruled the country through Henry VI, most historians agree. Let's compare Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions with the War of the Roses now. Andoria Atkaska III, Henry VI almost definitely, referred to in Final Fantasy Tactics as a weak king of ill health whose father died during the 50 Years' War, almost word for word the same as Henry VI. Loveria Atkaska, certainly Queen Margaret of Anjou. In the game, it states she's the brains behind the weak king. She bears one son that survives to become their heir, same as Margaret Anjou. Ordalia and the 50 Years' War equals France and the 100 Years' War. Again, hilariously on point. As mentioned before, this is the war that sets up all the further conflicts that cause the War of the Lions. On the verge of victory when the monarch dies during a battle and causes France or Ardalia to take most of the conquered lands back. That's where the one-for-one comparisons come to an end. The other major players of the Wars of the Roses don't have exact analogs in Final Fantasy Tactics. Warwick, the Kingmaker, who switched allegiance many times and in turn usually decided the changing of the crown, doesn't seem to have a placeholder here. A clear analog to the House of York or the Tudors isn't to be found in the storyline of Final Fantasy Tactics as well. To answer the main question, how much of Final Fantasy Tactics is inspired by the Wars of the Roses, I would say just the foundation. The actual flow of the story doesn't proceed down a path remotely similar to the Wars of the Roses. I'd argue that Matsuno probably just used the setup from the conflict and jumped off from there. The Dukes Larg and Goltana don't appear to be copy-pasted anywhere from the British conflict, and the Lucavi and the involvement of the Church don't come into play in the real world. Or do they? For those interested in learning more, I would refer you to Timeline's YouTube channel to watch Britain's Bloody Crown, a 4-part documentary series. It's a little reductive, but will give you a good idea of similarities without the commitment of reading a whole book. Also, check out Star's The White Queen, while historical fiction can help put faces to the names if you do wish to explore further. But now, let's talk about the actual game. If you've watched the last few videos or understand what a tactical RPG is, then Final Fantasy Tactics' systems won't seem that complicated. Most of the systems are similar to or streamlined from Tactics Ogre. The tile-based movement carries over. Certain jobs, abilities, and items can enhance your movement range and jump ability for scaling higher elevations. Win conditions usually consist of defeating the whole enemy party, assassination missions where you have to defeat just the leader, or rescue missions where you are tasked with saving a guest character. To achieve those goals, damage must be done. Attacks can be either physical or magical. Accuracy of direct physical attacks depends on whether you're attacking an enemy from the front, side, or back, and what items and abilities they have equipped. Shields, for instance, can make attacking a knight head-on almost impossible. But why Final Fantasy Tactics is so fondly remembered is its job system. Robust and ultimately unbalanced if you grind enough, though admittedly that can be said of most games, the system allows for near limitless customization options. You start off with a few jobs at the outset: Squire, Chemist, and Knight. By performing actions successfully, you gain experience for your level, but also JP, or job points. These points are used to unlock skills in your current class and also contribute to a job level. If you level up certain jobs to prerequisite levels, you unlock new job classes, and so on. But, and here's the fun part, you get to mix and match many different skills and abilities from your collective pool of jobs to create your own special units. There are limits, and that's what in my opinion creates the perfect difficulty curve. You can't just remain in the same class you're comfortable with if you want your units to grow, for a number of reasons. The scaling of stats in the first few classes would lead your units to be weaker in the long run, and you'd soon master those jobs, which means there would be no more new skills to learn. You have to change jobs and unlock new ones in order to get most of the good abilities, and once you unlock an ability, you can use it with any other class. To illustrate, each unit has an inherent skill to that job. A chemist has the inherent ability to use item as their base skill. They also have a secondary skill, and this can be any base skill from another class. So, you could have a chemist that can use the break art abilities from the knight class, so they could use items and break equipment of enemy units. Then there's the reaction skill. These include abilities like counter or auto potion. These are abilities that trigger as a reaction to something like a physical attack or HP loss. Their triggering is dependent on the unit's bravery level. Essentially, the higher the bravery, the higher percentage chance you have of your unit successfully triggering the reaction ability. Support abilities are abilities that are always active, like JP Boost, that provides the unit with more JP for every action, or Dual Wield, that allows them to wield 2 swords. Then there's a move ability, like Move 3, that increases movement, you guessed it, by 3, or Lava Walking, which, again, you get the idea. The addictive nature of gaining JP, unlocking new jobs, unlocking new skills, combining new skills with your existing skill set in dynamic and inventive ways to tackle the surmounting challenges, while still not getting too comfortable with one formation so that you can keep unlocking new skills and jobs, is what keeps people coming back time and time again to Final Fantasy Tactics. The creator of the ATB system and the job system in Final Fantasy V that let players switch between jobs, Hiroyuki Ito, was the designer of Final Fantasy Tactics. In an interview, shouts out Schmublations, he says that he does not like strategy games because of how much time spent outfitting and preparing your characters. Because of that, he strove and succeeded in creating a system where it's just as fun to customize your units as it is battling with them. By streamlining the larger parties and bigger battlefields of Tactics Ogre into smaller squads of usually 5, but with the abilities of 2 different classes each, thus not sacrificing much nuance, Ito creates faster and more intimate skirmishes. The smaller battlefields, it's revealed in the same interview, were a decision made for performance. Used to the snappy speed of cartridge-based games, they wanted to preserve the 60 FPS standard, even on the CD-ROM. That meant scaling back the size of the battlefields. Funny that the PS1 version runs so smooth, but as we'll see in the PSP port, this is not the case. The PSP chugs hard, mainly when a summon or magic ability is performed. When I played through the PSP version for the first time, I hadn't played through the PS1 version in years, so the slowdown didn't bother me too much. But now playing through both at the same time, it's painful to see the knock in performance the PSP version suffers. And why? The PSP is ostensibly more powerful than a PS1, right? I haven't been able to find online a specific reason for the slowdown, but it can be patched out with mods if you feel like doing some research. It's hard to say which version to recommend. There's the mobile version.
Now, if you're playing
Final Fantasy Tactics
on a telephone, you will never in a trillion years experience the film. You'll think you have experienced it, but you'll be cheated. It's such a sadness that you think you've seen a
Final
film
Fantasy
on your
Tactics.
fucking telephone. Get real.
So it's between the PS1 and the PSP, and both have their strengths. Again, the PS1 runs buttery smooth, but the PSP version has extra content, a better translation, and cool new CG cutscenes. I'd recommend probably the PSP version for first-time players to get the story. And since you wouldn't have played the PS1 version to know how well it could run, you won't notice the slowdown as much, unless you've just watched this video. Or just patch out the slowdown. Probably do that. For anyone who's played the PSP version and wants to revisit the game, I'd recommend the PS1 version. The story is still somewhat comprehensible, but the game just runs like a dream. And looks better, at least to me, playing through a PS3 and turning off the PS1 smoothing to see each individual pixel. Mileage may vary, or do what I did and play them both at the same time, like a lunatic. But yeah, the relocalization with the PSP War of the Lines version is the biggest get for that port. Sure, there's some added characters and classes, and those are fun. The game also adds multiplayer with melees, which are PvP, and rendezvous, which are cooperative battles with a friend, both of which have exclusive gear, and as long as you can find a friend with a PSP, they can be played locally, even now. And the PSTV supports the multiplayer as well, I found out during my playthroughs. The story, some would say a brave story. Wait for laughter. Okay? Well, laughter. When I was 6 years old playing through it, I assumed I was just dumb and didn't understand the PS1 version because I was 6 years old. Turns out, even though that probably didn't help, the PS1 localization is pretty bad. I still have a soft spot for it, and there are some choice lines, blame yourself, or God, being an internet favorite. Having played through the game many times at this point in my life, and with the PSP localization in hand, I can now say I understand the story. It's a complex, dark fantasy political thriller or something. Very similar in tone to Tactics Ogre, but much more linear. Which isn't to say it's easy to digest. I wouldn't admit to understanding the differences of all the factions and the various plot points fully until my last 2 playthroughs.
I came here to drink milk and kick ass. And I've just finished my milk.
Without getting into spoilers, you play as Ramza Beowulf, the youngest son of a famous knight. The game starts with a flash forward with you, Ramza, a mercenary, tasked with protecting a Princess Ovelia. Your band of mercenaries are ambushed by a group of Black Lion Knights. I think that's what they're called. You defeat them, but a mysterious man that you seem to know named Delita absconds with the princess while riding a chocobo. The game then flashes back to you and Delita, who turns out to be your lower-class friend from childhood, as trainees in an order of knights. There's a lot of lore that is optional in the game. If you choose to read all of the Brave story entries and read the rumors in the bars, you will get a better sense of the game world and the conflict your characters are embroiled in. The story goes places and spans 4 chapters, all of which feel important and substantial. There are side quests, but not enough, and most, if not all, are only accessible during the final chapter. Unlike Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together, which has too much in the way of side quests, Final Fantasy Tactics could always use more. The optional errands you can send your units on to gather artifacts or discover magical locations feel uninspired and serve only as a way to earn a little JP on your less useful units. The twists and turns of the story are best left to experience yourself. In a future video, we may delve into the future of the series and where it could or should go. Turns out there were plans for a Final Fantasy Tactics 2, but they were scrapped. Matsuno revealed some pre-production documents during a Final Fantasy XIV livestream that show a possible direction the series never took. Of course, the legacy of the game and Ivalice, the game world, live on through its spiritual successors. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is a great game in its own right, but has a completely different tone. It doesn't really make up for not being a direct sequel. Its sequel, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance 2 A2, the sequel to A1 Steak Sauce, is also a pretty good game, but didn't leave a mark as deep as either of its predecessors. Vagrant Story, Matsuno's next game after Tactics, was retconned to take place in Ivalice and has a similar mood to Tactics, but has more in common gameplay-wise with Parasite Eve, with maybe a dash of Front Mission 3. There will inevitably be a video where I explore Matsuno's less tactical work with Vagrant Story, Final Fantasy XII, Mad World, and Crimson Shroud, and see how they might direct his future trajectory. Final Fantasy XII is also an interesting one to look at, a game that I wanted to love but ended up disliking. I'm excited to give it another chance with the recent Zodiac International version on the PS4. Matsuno's departure from Square during the troubled production of 12 is a cloudy subject, and also the arguments that 12's development woes caused the whole numbered Final Fantasy series to get off track, resulting in the 13 trilogy, is another point of fascinating discussion that we will get into. Matsuno seems to be back in Square Enix's good graces with his involvement in the Return to Ivalice raid in Final Fantasy XIV. I have a lot of entries in the series to play through before I'll be in any position to delve into that one, but it is of utmost importance in seeing where Matsuno's career will go. So what's next for Final Fantasy Tactics? Matsuno has said in an interview that he doesn't like working on sequels, and so it seems wrong to want him to work on a direct sequel. Yet, there were plans, as he revealed himself. In another interview, I swear he says he should make at least one sequel to Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Ogre before he dies. The most logical road, in my opinion, is for an enhanced port of Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions for Switch, to gauge support by the sales and to smooth over the flaws in the PSP version's slowdown, to bring the game to a current platform and possibly add more side quests or online support for the rendezvous and melees. Then, if the game does well enough, work on a direct sequel. The design documents that Matsuno recently revealed showed the planned Final Fantasy Tactics 2 to have a hex tile-based system instead of grid-based, and 2D rather than 3D. The sprite work and the battlefields look amazing if they're actual screenshots and not just artistic production renderings. We already have Final Fantasy Tactics, so I don't need Final Fantasy Tactics 2 to be that similar to the original. But continuing the story of Ramza, or at least taking place more directly near the original instead of the storybook Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, with its expanded races of Benga and Moogle. Okay, Moogles are okay, never mind. Somewhere in between could work as a bridge between the two series. There's lots of places you could go. Even a prequel during Saint Ajora's time could be really interesting. The city of Gaug hints at a time of vast technical superiority with flying airships and magic-powered machines. By Saint Ajora's grace! How have I not talked about the music yet? This is my favorite soundtrack of all time. I've been playing other games and turned off their music so I could play this soundtrack instead. Some of the first CDs I ever burned were this soundtrack, so that I could always listen to The Pervert or Bloody Excrement. This is Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Wada's magnum opus. Apoplexy is still the greatest battle theme ever made. opinion. There's a darkness, there's an oppressiveness in this soundtrack that sets the mood so perfectly. There are even a few cheerier battle themes, but for the most part, these tracks are dense. And Requiem can almost have me in tears. And just like the art style and the world design, the music puts me in this land of Ivalice so effectively that it feels real. The reason this world has been used for so many other games after this original interpretation is because of the way all these elements come together to crystallize into a believable sense of place. The music is another category where the PS1 version soars. Some of the sound effects and songs sound less rich and more strident in the PSP version. To touch on the evolution of the art style from Tactics Ogre, you've been watching the art style of the game this whole video, and there's nothing else quite like it. I mean, who needs noses? Am I right, Krillin? Side note, in the Dissidia game, Ramsey gets a nose. Weird. In an interview with Matsuno about Vagrant Story, double check, he talks about his design philosophy, and one of his guiding principles is freedom. He wants players to have the freedom to explore the systems and not feel like there's only one way to beat a boss or finish an encounter. I think that's the thing that may surprise people who haven't played Tactics, but only admired it from a distance. The game is so stacked with systems and mechanics, with faith and bravery, the job system, Zodiac system. You gotta take into account elevation, enemy orientation, charge times, that I wouldn't blame people for being intimidated. But in playing the game, unlocking the jobs and skills, the game gives you such a feast of options to tackle any situation. Like the chemistry system in Breath of the Wild or the base components of Magic the Gathering, the system becomes intuitive, and as you stack onto that core foundation, the possibilities feel endless and organic. Maybe not organic. It's pretty inorganic to just hit somebody with a rock over and over again and then learn a spell for fire, but whatever. I wanted to highlight a lesser known aspect of Final Fantasy Tactics in this video. While researching content that was cut from the North American version, I stumbled onto music that was in the sound test, but not in the actual game. It was cut because it played during the sound novels that were dummied out of the release we got here in the States. The closest thing to the sound novels that exist in the normal game is when you read through the Germanic scriptures. But instead of pure text, the sound novels have some interactivity. The first one plays like a choose-your-own-adventure book. The other two, that have actually been translated, aren't as robust, but are still involved enough to take an hour or so. The sound novels feel sort of like Final Fantasy VII's mini-games and diversions, existing purely to make the game world feel bigger in scope. The Tactics sound novels accomplish this, but their extreme tangentiality and text density makes it no surprise that they were cut for Western release. I am disappointed that with the new opportunity, they were never added to the War of the Lions version, but there is a mod called The Lion War that added them in, and also one mod that just adds them in, with no other changes to the game. You have to get certain artifacts in the game, and then press triangle. One of the four isn't really doable with its current machine translation, but the other three, credit Rosa, are all very worthwhile. The closest thing I can liken them to is the Lost Odyssey sound novel type things, but with more user choice and less production values. Interesting to note, the majority of the music used in the sound novels was done by pretty much unknown composers, and I think they reused one of the worst tracks from it in one of the PSP Rendezvous matches. Another interesting thing about the sound novels is how they link Tactics to many other Final Fantasy entries, with reference to Palamecia, Mako, I like saying Mako, Magitech, and a possible Golden Saucer precursor called the Golden Palace, where chocobo racing was its main function. Some of these could be put in by the translator as allusions, but with Cloud already being present in the game, the ties to Final Fantasy VII are already present without the sound novels. There's even a possibility that the teleporter that Cloud arrives in could just be a time travel device, because at least one of the translations refer to it as such, which would mean Final Fantasy Tactics takes place way before or way after 7, and then thusly 10, 2, right? I don't know. These kind of linkages don't really interest me. Getting the sound novels to work took me an afternoon. First you gotta get the PS1 emulator working, then you gotta patch the mod onto your ISO to get the novels working again. Then, if you don't want to play through the entire game, on that, you gotta download a save, and then download a program that can mod that save to unlock all the artifacts. And then you also have to realize you do have to press triangle to start the novels, which could take some people, for instance me, 30 minutes to figure out. But it was worth it. Before researching for this video, I didn't even know they existed. Shmuplations is again to thanks for their translations of the original sound test that included notes on each track, which led me to find the unreleased tracks that were still present in the sound test. That in turn led me to the sound novels. So crazy. You can still find out new things about your favorite game, even after 20 years. Oh yeah, and the T in Final Fantasy Tactics is also the same shape as the T-like cross thing Obelia is praying to at the opening of the game. That's kind of cool. Look how happy Tita is. On the next episode of the Tactical RPG Odyssey, Ogre Battle 64, Person of Lordly Caliber. Hey Rams, remember how your dad taught us how to play the reed flute? Oh yes, I remember that, Delita, when my father taught us how to play the reed flute. That's some good stuff, Ramza.
What's a nose, Delina?